The time that people find each other most attractive is when they see their partner at a distance. Those can make that mistake, men and women, that they think they can say hard things to each other. They can't. You can do it, you'll get away with it, but it's never forgotten.
They tracked the number of orgasms women reported having every week, and they found that number one was Belgium.
Yes.
13.86. Two was France at 11.34, and Ireland.
There's a very strong instinct in us all to repeat. You know, people, if you think about that in the sexual sense, that I meet a lot of women who are in situationships, and I would say they are kidding themselves.
You had one piece of advice for people looking to improve their sex lives. Stephanie Regan, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Conor. I'm kind of happy to be here and interested to see where this conversation goes.
Where are you from, Stephanie? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Dublin, Ireland. And actually, yeah, just in a family sense, I suppose, youngest of 13, 7 brothers, 5 sisters. So quite a little, I suppose quite a lot of experience in the family relationships scenario. So maybe that's what got me going in this whole area. But yeah, big family situation.
How would you describe your childhood?
I would say very much kind of a lot of joy and happiness in my childhood. And I think that comes from the big family side of things. I also would have experienced being the child of an alcoholic. So I think I've learned a lot in that. And obviously, some things like that, I often think were prompts maybe that moved me towards psychotherapy in understanding my own story. Yeah.
So would you say the family dynamic was the inspiration for your journey into psychotherapy? Was it...
Yeah, I suppose I think what I mentioned there about, alcoholism and maybe trying to understand that in the growing up years, I would also say I had one brother who had a breakdown in college. And I think that would be another big motivator where you find yourself, and he was just 1 year older than me, and where you find yourself trying to understand or being, suddenly interfacing with the things that you have no answer for. And I think that was probably it, because at first I did not psychology, sorry, I did economics and maths in college. And actually I qualified in that. And but really I was never, so I have quite a rational side, obviously, quite a good rational side. But I was really more drawn to the softer skills and the softer side of things and understanding. And I think there's my motivation, I think. Yeah.
Stephanie, how important is sex in a long-term relationship?
Well, I think it's essential, but it changes over time. I think we have to, absolutely see that as the trajectory of that. Sex is what makes it completely different to friendship, isn't that it? If we want to just be simple about it, we all have good friends, best friends, but the difference with a partner or a mate or your husband or wife or whoever you've completely locked down with is that there is an attraction. You are mates. You physically comfort each other as well as all the other elements. I think sex has something very, very strong at the beginning, and it becomes something more different over time. I see it as something very comforting, very soothing, very supporting, very exciting. It has all these dimensions to it, but all those dimensions are different at different times and for different people. People, obviously the drive for sex is quite different as well in terms of the origin and your early sexualizations. Those things are really important. So there's so much to say in one sentence there. We'll just start now.
Brilliant. In terms of a clinical setting, when people present to you, you work a lot with couples and individuals. What are the most common issues relating to sex that you find between couples in say, long-term relationships or marriages?
I would say that I sometimes think that people see it as something very instinctive that continues. Whereas I suppose, if I'm honest, I think that's one of the problems, that the intensity, which is, let's be honest, intoxicating, gorgeous intensity that, if you're lucky, we all get at the beginning of relationships, where everything is right, everything works, everything is lovely, you're seeing everything in a great way, you're seeing each other in a lovely way. And that is the falling in love stage, and it's fantastic. And it does last, with couples, it lasts for quite a long time. And for some, it lasts instinctively. But really, the instinctive thing is that they're doing the right things to keep it going. They're creating space for each other. They're creating time. They're also not merged. You know, a big problem in relationships is if you become so close that you're so together that there is no distance for the desire or the fancy or the, you know, there's got to be something there. You know, it's not just wash the dishes, is it? Put them all in the press and go off and have, you know, fabulous sex. I mean, you got to be highly motivated for that. You need a little bit around it. And I think good couples sort of instinctively know that. You know, they create the night. They don't do anything extraordinary, but they create the time for each other, and they want to be together. They want to hear each other, and they want to go and enjoy things together. And, you know, the time that, you know, if you're in a partnership and it's 10 years or 15 years and all that fabulous, you know, wild hormones have settled down, the time that people find each other most attractive is when they see their partner at a distance doing something that they are very involved in, like immersed in. And I think if every one of us reflect, we know that when you're at a party and you look across and you think, yeah, he's handsomer than I thought. You know, I've kind of forgotten about that. It's kind of an interesting thing, because you're sort of getting a glimpse of the girl or the guy that you were sort of moved towards in the first place. So I just think that's interesting. So you have to create it. I think that's why some couples really get it right.
So familiarity and constant companionship can be wonderful, but it can also be detrimental sexually. To
yes,
desire.
I think so. Yes, it can be. You have to make absolute steps. I think you have to stop thinking it all just keeps happening. You must remember that the reason it happened at the beginning was because you didn't know her. You didn't know him.
Mystery.
Whichever it is. You were reaching out to know more about this person. And it was in that gap and reaching out that the attraction was completely there. And as you get to know everything, and let's be honest, as you get to know the bad things and the bad sides, you know, and the things that annoy us and drive us crazy, it's quite easy to get that feeling that you kind of know this person inside out. So we have to continue to create a little distance, because desire is in that slight distance.
Yeah. Distance and mystery
yes,
will foster it. Do you find couples, when they present, that sex has become completely absent in their lives?
Yes, I do. Not so often, funny. You know, mostly because I'm not a sex therapist in that sense. I'm a psychotherapist. So people who have functional problems with sex, you know, what this person is not receptive. They're finding things, you know, are sore. They're difficult. You know, they're having real sort of functional issues, as I say. I would often refer people to a sex therapist who's good on technique, good on, you know, all of the, obviously I would know some of them myself that I've learned over time in the work, and I can mention some things like that. But usually the problems that people present with around sex are much more that sex has been stopped or sex has been shut down in many ways, because the connection is gone, the communication is gone, the softness towards each other is gone. That's something I really notice people let go of. And I think sex goes out the door with it, is softness, you know, where they become hard to each other. Couples can make that mistake, men and women, that they think they can say hard things to each other. They can't. You can do it, you'll get away with it, but it's never forgotten, I think, in the intimacy of relationship. I think it's like shaving off a layer. You know, it's a gentle structure. And if you want your partner to feel, you know, really at home with you and really excited with you at the same time, it's got to be a very safe, free space. And I think that these sort of harsh criticisms greatly damage that.
I think that's a great lesson there. Be mindful of really harsh criticisms in the moment, and maybe a little bit of self-censorship every now and again.
Even a lot.
Yeah.
That goes for women and men.
Yeah.
You know.
Okay, so you have a brilliant podcast called Tough Love, and in one of the episodes, you mentioned there was a study done by Victoria Milan, the dating agency, and they were tracking reported orgasms, right?
Yes.
Across Europe. They tracked the number of orgasms women reported having every week, and they found that number one was Belgium.
Yes.
13.86. 2 was France at 11.34, and Ireland at 10.6 orgasms women were reporting per week.
Mm-hmm.
That might be surprising to some. What's your
Yeah.
perspective on those numbers?
Yeah, it is kind of surprising, and of course, I don't have the backup. I have to be honest. The backup, sort of groupings and
Sample
ages.
sizes
Lots of exactly sample size. Lots of research can be. I think of them more like surveys than research. And in some respects, the sample sizes, determines an awful lot. But still, you can get a snippet, and you're getting a snapshot, and it's no harm to think about that. So, in terms of orgasms and Irish women, I would say, I think that Irish women, I wouldn't be surprised that on average they're very satisfied in that, in a sexual sense. I think in the older age groups when there was a lot of oppression around sex, and in many ways, I always think of that as just about 10 years before me. It's kind of funny. I even see it in a group, in groupings, because obviously, again, I'm at the youngest end of the family, and I don't mean it like, sisters, brothers, but there was a very big difference in 10 years. It was almost like when contraceptives came into Ireland, when sexuality became something you could completely own and speak about, where people could go out and have sex with someone, and it wasn't, you wouldn't tell everyone about it because it's a private world, but people weren't judging each other. So there was, it's big change. And I think that, so from that grouping downwards, anyone now in their 50s, 40s, 30s, 20s, they see sex as a normal part of life, a normal part of connecting. Sometimes it's fun, sometimes it's much more, sometimes it's just for me, sometimes it's just for you, sometimes for both. And we're all okay with that, as long as everybody is safe and feeling okay in that. So I think in that world, I expect orgasms to be more normal, much more normal for Irish women. Yeah.
There was another, the chemical oxytocin.
Yes.
Okay, so what is oxytocin, and why does it affect women more so than men?
Yes, I think things affect men differently. Yes. So, well, oxytocin is the chemical that drops when women breastfeed, for example. Okay. I always think that's the best way to think of it. And as somebody who has done so, I can tell you that the only way I could describe it is it's almost like that feeling of overall calm. It gives you a feeling of almost like that sense you might have if you've had a half of a pre-med, where you kind of, you just feel very calm, very warm to the world. And so it has this glow. And the idea is very simply that oxytocin is what rises when we begin to fall in love, and touch brings it in. Obviously, breastfeeding brings it in, but touch brings it in mostly. And once oxytocin is present, your view of the person in front of you is quite rosy, quite different, and quite good, obviously. And it does also affect men. This is very well shown that touch, and we leave sex aside, touch, hugging, just the physicality and the comfort of that brings oxytocin to the fore in both of us. And what it does also, which I think is really interesting, is it makes me, that glowy feel that we talk about, that people are more forgiving, couples are more forgiving to each other. In other words, might have been arguing with you yesterday, but if the oxytocin is up to date, then kind of say, well, maybe it's not that important. It's just it just takes the edge off the view and perspective and the harshness, so that it brings that softness back between you. That's why sex is important. That's why touching is important for couples over time. And that's why if sex has become an issue, we really still move towards and encourage people to be tactile, be fond, be gentle, to be close. Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard it described before as the bonding chemical. So
100%.
It's bonding people together.
Yes.
I think we touched it on already, but it's worth going back to. So desire and attraction in a long-term relationship.
Yeah.
Would you say that distance, mystery? So one thing a couple could do, for example, would be somebody goes away for 2 weeks. They separate and come back together. They separate and come back together. Would that be a remedy for this familiarity issue?
Yes, but, well, yes and no. I mean, it may not be practical to be doing the constant yin and yang and of such a thing. I think it's a little more abstract than that. It's both in the physical distance. In other words, you don't need to be ever present to each other all the time, but that can be done by that can also be affected by creating your own life, having your own interests. So you have things together and apart. Another thing that I think is very good for sparking desire in a couple is doing something new together, brand new, where neither of you have the skill, neither of you, it may be I don't know, you take up, it could be kayaking, could be, a physical thing, and or just even, it could be cycling, could be something less strenuous, but something that you're both sort of starting in the same place. And okay, so one might be stronger or one might be ever. And then you have the fun of sort of learning, the fun of maybe even competing a little. All these things sort of spark something fresh. It's the unfreshness of familiarity. And I mean, I think instinctively everybody who listens knows that. You just feel, I mean, is it TV and Netflix all the time? It's boring. It's the truth, isn't it?
Do you find couples in relationships, they've stopped communicating when it comes to talking about sex, for example, and intimacy? Do you find a complete breakdown there? I mean, we are notorious as an Irish society for previously having difficulties in terms of communication.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we don't have a great language for sex, do we? We're not, I mean, I really think children need to be introduced. I mean, I'm completely on the Dutch school of thought on this. They bring children into school, they teach them the language of their body, they teach them the language of the yes and no. It's not just about consent, it's also about teaching them to kind of understand themselves and be able to say what they want, sexually and otherwise. And yes, I completely think it's about the language of learning it. So I'm totally for that. In terms of adults, I think that, again, it's back to something I mentioned at the beginning, the instinctive thing. Kind of people think you should know, there's a lot of this. I think you should know by now. Should you know by now? I don't get that. No, you're supposed to kind of communicate. Your job in the relationship is to communicate, and not just outwards, but inwards, to both say it and also hear it from, both sides. And I think that sometimes people just rely on, in a kind of a judgmental way, that we should all understand if we're together, you should know, you should understand. I've said it before. I don't think so. I think you have to have this constant ongoing communication. This, as I say, this ongoing kind of love communication where you say, where one complements the other, where one how would I say, acknowledges and reconfirms and says, lets you know that was good, that wasn't good, and what's important now, because we keep changing, you see. So what worked before doesn't maybe work now. So I think you're right. There's a slowness in it, and I mean, I find it incredibly interesting. I do a little bit of TV work and radio work, and almost every single time I go into those buildings, somebody takes me aside and says, "You don't mind if I just ask you about?" and I think it's really interesting that we're in this whole business of communication, but people don't talk to their friends about things like that, because it's kind of the private world, isn't it? Your private relationship world. And of course you're protecting it, and I understand that. But, people don't want friends to know that maybe your sex life is bad, or it's good, it feels too demanding, or whatever it is. So I do understand that. But at the same time, I think we can normalize the chit chat, that can be a positive chit chat. And I also think between couples, you've got to say more than our sex life isn't good. You've got to find ways to break that down, and and be willing to sort of try and work around it and try something different. And I don't mean we're not talking about exotic, we're not talking about the mechanics of it. We're talking about what's not good, who's not giving time, why are we not special to each other? What's going on here? Yeah.
Studies that I've heard reported online, studies from David Buss, studies from people in the evolutionary psychology space, indicate that sexual variety is very important to men. And apparently it's significantly more important to men than it is to women. Have you encountered that in practice? And what's your perspective on the issue of sexual variety in a long-term relationship, for example?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you're right. We you know, I did actually read that piece of research, and there was another aspect to it, which was what do men regret most?
Mm.
You know, if they've been in a kind of a long-term relationship, or if they had more time, or if they had more opportunity, what would they do? They would have more variety. And whereas women, that's not the case. Well, I mean, that's just simple evolution. You know, women, we survived, and our children survived by honing in on one partner who would protect and mind us, and or a family or a unit. You know, whereas for men, for their genes, if you like, to continue successfully, well, the more women they impregnated, the more likely their gene pool was going to survive. So I think it's a very, it's very evolutionary in that sense. But I think that it's of course we've moved into the monogamous space, but it is kind of interesting that that is changing again. And I think it is changing again. I mean, it's changing, you could say, is it because we're living longer? Is it because marriages now are much longer? And 50% of marriages in the Western world, not necessarily in Ireland, but in general and in the States, and we tend to follow that model gradually over time, it's 50% of marriages break. So I think we have to ready ourselves for that reality. And I think there is something changing. I don't think it's actually clear exactly what's changing yet, but I don't think it's that men are rushing back to the variety factor, if you like. I don't think it's that. I think it is myself that people recognize the challenge of marriage. And over time, maybe in order to let those marriages survive, maybe some people are moving towards the variety. There may be an aspect of, I see that quite little, certainly in Ireland. I see that very little. It does happen, but it's fairly little, fairly small in numbers. Now, I'm not the complete barometer on that, but I suppose I'm getting as much exposure to it as probably any other clinician around. I think there is something changing though also in younger people. I was speaking to someone in Germany, and they were saying young people are less interested in marriage. Now in Ireland, they're very in the marriage space still. That could be our religious sort of and traditional kind of hangover time, so to speak. But you know, when you speak to people in Europe, in younger people, young professionals in Europe, they're looking more for partners that maybe for a period of time. You know, they're not racing for marriage. They're looking for partnership. They're maybe not also racing towards children. And so the issue of children is way down the line. And I think that's kind of interesting. Marriage is getting deferred and deferred and deferred. Now, we know it's got a little deferred here, and the average age here is more like 36 for guys, 34 for girls. But I think just and marriage rates in Ireland are still quite good. You know, they're still quite high. But in other countries, I think there's a slightly different dynamic happening.
Do you think there's an option for kind of a tiered pricing when it comes to marriage? And what I mean by in terms of longevity, so you say you have a lifelong marriage, you have a 15-year marriage, you have a 5-year marriage. And at the end of that time period, you can choose to renew or not. What's your thought on that one?
Well, it's the 7-year itch thing, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, well, there's a lot
for divorce, like it might inhibit these catastrophic divorces.
Yes, that there would be like a tiered almost commitment.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying? Yeah. In some respects, I mean, the complexity of, you see, the family system has served society very well, if you think of it that way. It has served us well because it is, you know, it allows for connection, it allows for bonding, it allows for stability, security. I think it also provides for an sort of an interconnectedness in terms of responsibility, ownership, all of those things. So there's a lot to be lost when you break up the system. But I think, as you say, right, the system can be reformed. You know, I'm not a sociologist in that sense, and I think they have a lot to say on that. And I think but I really think there's something shifting. I can feel it in my work. I can feel it in the problems that come up, the encounters that women are having, that men are having. Something is changing. And yet now in Ireland, because I am an Irish-based therapist, there is definitely still a huge grow, as we would put it, for the marriage route, for sure. And I don't think that's going to change in Ireland, probably for another, we're probably in that 40, 50 years. You know, it's going to take that time. It's a generational thing, I think, for that to shift and become less the norm. Presently, it's still the absolute norm.
In your experience and in terms of your clinical practice, I was curious about this question. Can relationships recover from infidelity? I wanted to get your perspective.
Yeah. Well, infidelity. Infidelity is almost always a destroyer, I think, in relationships. Particularly, I suppose there's a timing factor. You know, it probably has a greater sort of destructive quality at the beginning than it does a little later, although also has the power to destroy it. It also depends why it happened, how it happened. You know, was it a one-night stand? Was it with drink? Was it opportunistic? Was it, you know, was it unintended? Or was it, you know, did it involve lying over 6 months, 2 years? And was there love? You know, was it a love affair? Infidelity, you know, we like to think of infidelity as somebody cheating on somebody, and somebody is bad and somebody isn't. And I see infidelity in a bigger framework, and I see it as somebody finding themselves maybe just with opportunity and maybe just being weak in the moment. Fine. Somebody maybe having drink and being and falling, you know, falling into the moment. Not admirable, maybe, not great, whatever. But there's all sorts, you know, you may not admire the person for it, but, you know, we're just people. People make mistakes. That's the world we navigate. But I think that also there is usually something shifting around it. You know, we like to think it's just somebody, you know, does the wrong thing. But usually behind it, there is it's often a reach out for independence. It's a reach out for maybe more sex. Maybe it's a reach out for more satisfaction. That was always the old style thing. Oh, somebody's not getting what they need at home. You know, well, it's a much bigger picture than that. I often think it's also, is somebody reaching out for that sort of part of themselves that they feel has sort of died in the relationship or is dying. And those kinds of situations, they can be fixed, because maybe the person still does love and want the relationship that they're in, but this act of sexual infidelity has in some way put words on or acted out what should have been spoken out. And I suppose that's where I come in often, is in drawing that together. And I've certainly seen that many times, and I've seen it successfully dealt with. Trust obviously can be difficult afterwards, but good couples can work that out, you know. Yeah, I think now if it's a 20-year affair, we're talking about a different level. So there's a few levels there.
On your podcast, there's a fascinating story. You were treating or working with a man who was seeing an escort at lunchtime, right?
Yes.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Right? And it was.
I mean, almost every lunchtime.
So 5 days a week, he's in the office. That is. What do you think how prevalent is sex addiction? Would you describe that to sex addiction, or is there something else going on there?
Yeah, I think I thought it was very interesting and funny. I just did a podcast yesterday. We talked a lot about addiction in relationships, and sex addiction was one of them. And I would say there's often something else going on, but there's sometimes not something else going on. But in this instance, and the insight that I got, because we're all learning all the time, the insight that I got was that for this man, he possibly there was a slight, you know, his early sexualization might have impacted a little, but also he found it hard to enter his own sort of, if you like, desire, and while having to think about somebody else at the same time. And so he wasn't really able to be in relationship and be very sexual. It was slightly, so he could only see his wife sort of in a kind of a, not in a non-sexual way, but he couldn't really enjoy it fully without being able to abandon her, you know. And I think what what the sex worker in this instance gave is the exclusivity and the opportunity for him to just completely focus on himself. So there was a complete selfishness factor to it. But I'm not saying that in a negative way, but a selfishness factor, which I think he was trying to accommodate in himself, and in some way not break his marriage up at the same time. So there was a kind of, and then it grew to an addiction. It grew to an addiction because of course, sex, like many other things, brings up all these endorphins in us, and they bring up the oxytocin, as we mentioned. There is a kind of a dopamine lift as well. So there's a kind of a mood lift to it. And so that's where the addiction can come in. There can be a kind of a physiologically addictive factor to it as well.
And can you work with clients? And what percentage are male, by the way, and what percentage are female in your?
Kind of 50-50, because I was just mentioning that to you at the outset. I think it just comes from the fact that I always worked in the corporate world in my sort of practice. I used to have contracts with various companies, and a lot of them were male-dominated companies, and maybe that together with the couple work kind of has always given me, and maybe it was the Seven Brothers as well, of course, but it's always given me I have a very even sort of sense about men. And also I'm a mother to a son, and I think who's sort of 33 now, and I think it gives you do need to understand the male world. The male world, the female perspective on the male world isn't often that clear. And I always feel very much that men have different challenges. Men have a when they talk about when women get married, when men get married, I mean, my experience is men get married when they're ready. Men commit when they're ready. It's not about who they, of course it's about who they meet eventually, but in reality, it's more about timing than the who. It's like a click for men. They just click and they kind of go, it's time for me to settle down. Boom. Could be three weeks later, they meet there and they get serious about that girl. That's how it works. Women, it's not the same.
How is it different for women?
I think women in some ways are primed. We're primed to be ready earlier. I think men are also, they want to be, and again, this is the evolutionary thing. Men want to be capable of their own independence. They want to be able to provide. They want to be able to look after a woman if that woman is with him, and to be able to provide. They kind of inside themselves, without even articulating it, that's what they're trying to do. And when the money comes in and they realize they've got the house, they've got the mortgage in order, what's the next thing? Boom. That's how it happens. But for women, on the other hand, we're at an evolutionary level, we're ready. We're ready very early. And now some women are taught, and we're in Ireland seeing it, we're taught to build career first. And to be, to stay in education. And that has deferred women's desire, I think, to settle, which I think is a good thing, I have to say. Because I think then you have mature, I know we can talk about all the having babies early and all that malarkey, but, in reality, I think it makes mature women make good mothers, good, happier lives, build better lives for themselves, for their children, for their families, all of that. So, yeah, I see it as a plus.
So pornography in clinical practice, right? Are you finding, and that the people are presenting, and men in particular are presenting, and pornography is having a significant negative effect on their relationships and their sex lives? What would your perspective be there?
I've had less men coming with that issue, I have to say, although I think it is an issue for younger men. Maybe I see little less of the cohort which this might impact, which might be more in the 20s or in the sort of 18, I would think 18 to 26, that kind of grouping. So I might see less there, but I absolutely would be confident that it is warping their sense of sex, their sense of connection, what it's about. And what I do definitely see is the impact on women, that I think they feel an obligation to deliver something in that really they don't have the instinct for. And I think it does warp the whole sexual encounter. Now, remember, I deal a lot with people in the 30s plus. That'd be, you know, mostly. And I would see it less so there. I think people kind of get through it in their 20s. They kind of realize, oh, you know, this is a put on situation, and they begin to see through that real life isn't like that, but it is something else. But I do see a damaging impact of porn. We're not going to take it away, obviously, you know, but I honestly feel that it is damaging for people's, even for the desensitizing, you know, and for what people are anticipating. And of course, most of all, for the early sexualization of it. I mean, we look at this imprint of sexualization psychologically. We always look back to see what were your early sexual experiences. I mean, if anybody has been abused or early, you know, just touched, intruded upon at a young age, but in a sexual way, it's a very strong template laid down for desire, and a very confusing one, and often, of course, the wrong one. So if you do that, if you think of it that way, and the first thing that really sexually excited a girl or a boy was looking at something, you know, as introduced in porn, it's quite confusing, and it lays a template which can be hard removed. I often think, if you think of it in sexual terms, you know, there is a very strong instinct in us all to repeat. You know, people, if you think about that in the sexual sense, that there's a tendency to kind of know that works and that was good and go right back there. So it's just that amplified. But if you take that from the very earliest, that's what's going on. So we are warping something that's really important, I think, in life. Yeah. And we do have to be careful of it. Yeah. And the later it can be introduced and the more controlled, the better. Obviously, the more adult the mind, the lesser the issue. But for the malleable, developing, evolving mind, yeah, I think it's really toxic.
I think for all of us that are parents, it is I suppose one of the biggest, it's a huge concern when you introduce technology and how you do that, and the implications of doing that. But okay, so what's your perspective on friends with benefits, the friends with benefits phenomenon, and what they call situationships?
Situationships, yeah. I think it's handy. I think it's easy. There may be a time when it's kind of fine and okay and good. Don't see anything wrong with it in that sense. But I think it does often go a little awry, because what might be okay, and for some it might be fine, but it is open to misunderstanding. It is also, it's slightly defying gravity, isn't it? That the more you have sex, the closer we know it brings you in some sense.
Oxytocin and all the bonding. Yeah.
So where's all that going then? You know, I meet a lot of women who are in situationships, and I would say they are kidding themselves. Largely, they are saying, you know, this is what I want, and it's fine and it works, but actually it's just deferring what they do want. They just have maybe given up for a while on what they want, and that's okay too. That's okay. Sometimes you need a breather from trying. Sometimes you don't need to be going forward all the time in life. But I think you have to be very careful, because people get very, very mixed up. They're getting involved and not meaning to get involved. And somebody, I think, often gets hurt. That's my experience of it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a power differential always, and there's an attraction differential. Somebody's always more attracted to somebody else. Plus, in a situationship, there's no momentum.
You're going nowhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's right.
So lastly, if you had one piece of advice for people looking to improve their sex lives in their relationship, it's a 5-year, 10-year, it's kind of on the wane a little bit. We know, we've established now how important it is.
Sure.
What would your advice be?
5 or 10-year relationship. I would say
significant long-term, yeah.
Significant long-term relationship. I think I really definitely would say never let sex slide off the agenda. You know, I think that's something that does happen. I would say that you should always sort of factor it in, always create space for it. And in truth, as a couple, you have to create a timeout. You know, it's not about technique. It's about time for each other. and bringing something new in all of the time that you do, not just sexually, but in your life. You've got to build, life has to stay interesting. It's quite interesting how people let things become very plateaued. Now, I know children can do that because, you're home every night, you're stuck with the kids, they're in bed at 8 and you have to, watch telly. There's all of that kind of thing. But you can, you don't take your eye off what's important. If there was one other thing I suppose I would often say to people is, come back to the good times, talk about it, think about it. What worked best? When were we closest? Recreate it a little bit. We all know role playing is kind of good, but it's not always necessary. Certainly, in a fibre, nothing wrong with it if it's what works for you. But I really think that what goes wrong is people don't continue the effort. And the other thing is that even if you don't feel like having sex in the female sense, men generally do mostly feel like having sex. It is important to kind of just work with it. In other words, have sex. I don't mean any way like offer it up kind of thing, but rather see that the important thing is rather like, as they say, going to the gym. You don't always feel like it, but you feel pretty good after.
Yeah, you made an interesting point there in terms of the sex drive, and that men are generally always ready for sex.
Reasonably ready. Yeah.
And I think probably, and both people in the relationship need to understand, I suppose, that there is that male drive, and men need to understand where women are coming from as well.
And we're different, and we're different, and that's fine. But not one better than the other, which I think is often, I do find men are put down a little bit for that, almost like, that it's this animalistic kind of, guy thing. It's not really. We're just different. And I think I see great strengths in the male sort of way, the way they can compartmentalize, the way they're, that's great psychological strengths in men that I think they're downgraded, to be honest with you, in our world today. We see this around, fatherhood. I mentioned that to you at one point. Fatherhood, fathers play an enormous part in the development of the individual in terms of how they love, the conditional way that they love children, the way they encourage risk in children. They encourage a risky kind of play, not dangerous, just risky. They also tend to be skill-based. They kind of upskill their children. And so we've loads of evidence around that. So I'm a real, of course I love women and I am a woman and I know what we have that is quite special, but we have weaknesses to our strengths. Every sort of, all the intuitiveness that women have, that's very good because we're very good for tending to the flock, tending to the group, tending to the child. Often, not every one of us, but often. But the underside of that is that we can overtend to detail. Men on the other side have the strength of compartmentalizing, like I mentioned there. And the underside of that is that they can be a bit kind of fixers, they're a bit too fixy in the relationship. They're not inclined to listen to all the detail that women maybe need to mention to understand what's going on for them. So there's many things like that, I suppose, around communication. But as you can probably see, I'm very 50-50.
Dr. Warren Farrell has done a lot of great work on this. In his book, he spoke about it, The Boy Crisis. He has a book called The Boy Crisis, Fatherless and the Absence of Fathers. And he calls it Dad Deprivation. Yeah. And it's having a massive significant, it's related to parental alienation. It's having a massive societal impact in the United States. And I suspect it's on its way. It's in the post.
Yeah. Oh, I think so. Funny, I did many years ago, I did something that I hoped I'd get out long before the podcasting time on fatherhood and on exactly that, because boys do need the male thinking around them. It's not that we can provide very well, and men can do the tending as well. Remember, there's lots of single fathers who do a fabulous job on the caring and the tending right from the word go. So we're not, and it's not anymore, as we know, a he-she thing. It's really the person who fosters that first year of life is really the carer, if you think of it in that way. It can be the mother, the father, or whatever. The child needs that constant one for that time. That becomes the more important kind of dynamic. But after that, the dynamic of three becomes a very important dynamic. I mean, I always see it as it represents the introduction of the world, the introduction of what is beyond the bonded mother-child, you know, sort of dyad. And so it's really important that that gets introduced to the child. And sometimes in the absence of fathers, that triangularization just doesn't happen. And so you see these then young men who are very emotional and very caught in the emotional, and don't feel strong in all these other scenarios of life where it's important to be the fixer and the sorter and the compartmentalizer. And they've lost those skills because they never were really introduced to them, or never, not so much introduced to them as much as they were parts of themselves that never saw the light of day.
Last question. Where can people find you, Stephanie?
Oh, okay. I am on Instagram, Stephanie Tough Love, and I have a website, stephanieregan.ie, and they can send me an email there.
And you've got a brilliant podcast called Tough
Love with matchmaker Mairead Lockman and I, and we have really enjoyed doing that.
I've checked it out. I'll put a link to it in the description box for this conversation.
Thank
it's
you.
fantastic.
Thanks
Thank you
so
so much, Stephanie.
Thank you, Conor.
It's lovely.